The entire room burst out laughing when the pregnant waitress set a dented tin box on the gift table of Chicago's most feared man. His fiancée called it garbage dragged in from a scrapyard, then tore the apron off the waitress's body in front of 200 of the city's most powerful guests, revealing the 7-month belly the pregnant girl had hidden for half a year just to keep her job. She did not argue. She said only 6 words: "I did not come to beg." Rowan Blackwood was a man who had never bowed to anyone. They said he counted the exits every time he entered a room, and never once sat with his back to a door. But that night, when he knelt to pick the tin box up off the marble floor, an old scent rose from it: licorice. The same scent he had last breathed at 19 years old, dying on the floor of a warehouse by the lake, while a night shift cleaning woman hid him for 11 days and pulled him back from the edge of his own grave. For 15 years, he never knew her name. That very night, he opened that box. Inside lay a cracked leather notebook, a brass key, and 11 pages written by a woman who had died 3 years earlier in her daughter's arms, in the falling snow, exactly 2 blocks from the hospital gate. The 12th page had been torn out, and what was written on that missing page, the page the waitress herself had torn away and hidden, would destroy an engagement, drag a crime boss into a federal interrogation room, and bring a man who had never knelt for anyone down onto the floor of his own celebration, because some gifts are not wrapped in gold, some debts cannot be paid with money, and some women are called nothing but the night cleaner, their entire lives until the night an entire city is forced to learn how to say her name. If this story touched something in you, leave a like, share it with the person who once lifted you up when you had nothing to give back, and subscribe to our channel, because kindness deserves to be remembered far longer than money ever will. 11 o'clock at night, the 41st floor of Kingsley Tower, and Delia Rook had passed table 32 for the 9th time that night. The silver tray in her hand was heavy with 4 glasses of wine and 1 untouched plate of oysters, the very thing the guest at table 17 had ordered and then changed his mind about. She didn't ask again. She simply turned, kept the tray level with her waist, and walked with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned that moving too fast would send the wine lapping against the rims of the glasses, while moving too slowly would make people notice. The synthetic leather shoes she had bought at a second-hand shop on Halsted Street had cracked at the left toe since last month. She had taped the inside with black tape, pressing it from the bottom upward so the patch wouldn't show when she walked. Her feet had begun swelling around 9 o'clock in the evening, and by now every step was a dull ache running all the way up her calves. She set the tray down on the bar, pushed the plate of oysters into the service return slot, then glanced quickly toward the wine storage door. No one was looking. She slipped inside, pulled the door nearly shut until only a narrow gap remained, and crouched down between 2 shelves of bottles. In the dim darkness, the smell of cork and damp oak settled over her. She closed her eyes. She counted. 40 seconds. No more. That was the number she had set for herself since summer. 40 seconds was enough for the pain in her feet to ease a little, enough for her breathing to return to normal, and not long enough for anyone to realize she had disappeared from the floor. She had tried 50 seconds once, back in September, and when she stepped out, the shift manager was standing at the bar, looking around with the expression of someone counting employees. Since then, she never counted past 40, 38, 39, 40. She braced one hand against the shelf, rose slowly, waited 3 seconds for the dizziness to fade, then stepped out. The restaurant floor was the same as ever. Astor and Vine was never crowded in the middle of the week, but it was always filled with exactly the right number of people needed to prove it was expensive. The sound of knives and forks touching porcelain, the sound of someone laughing softly at a corner table, the sound of piano music coming from speakers hidden in the ceiling. To the east, the entire wall was glass, and beyond that glass was Chicago in October, a glittering pit of light stretching all the way toward the lake. Delia no longer looked out the window. She had stopped looking after her first year. She took the order at table 23, wrote it down in her tight, crowded handwriting, then carried it into the kitchen. The steel swinging door struck her once in the back as she passed through, and at once the air changed. Heat, pans clattering, someone shouting a name. In the kitchen there was no music and no one pretended to be polite. Ezra Fallon stood at the end of the cooking line, sleeves rolled to his elbows, seasoning a pot of broth with the tip of his little finger. He was 58 years old, nearly 6 feet 3 inches tall, with hands so large that whenever he held a ladle, the ladle looked like a child's toy. He didn't turn when she came in. He never turned, but he knew she was there. He reached for a paper box already sitting on the cold prep counter, something he had wrapped at some point when no one had seen, then pushed it toward her while his eyes remained on the broth. "Eat." Delia stood still. "Ezra, it's not for you." He dipped the ladle in and stirred twice. "I made too much. Throwing it away would be a waste." She looked at the box. It was still warm. He had wrapped an extra layer of paper towel around the bottom to keep the heat from escaping, the same way he had been doing for 4 months now, ever since one evening in June that neither of them ever mentioned. He hadn't asked her a single question that night. He had only looked her over once, from head to toe, then turned away and started cooking more. "Can I eat in the changing room?" she said. "Where you eat is your business." He still didn't turn around. "But don't let it get cold. Cold, it loses the taste." Delia picked up the paper box. It was heavier than she had expected. She walked down the staff hallway, opened the changing room door, and stood for a moment before the long mirror mounted on the metal locker. The ceiling light in here was white and harsh, the kind of light that forgave no one. She looked at her reflection in it, a 27-year-old woman with brown hair hastily tied back and 2 dark circles beneath her eyes, wearing a black uniform exactly 2 sizes too big for her. She set the food box on the bench. Then she reached both hands behind her back, untied the knot of her apron, pulled the strings out a little farther, and tied them again, tighter. She pulled hard until the fabric stretched and pressed close against her body, until the curve she had seen in the mirror disappeared beneath the black cloth. She drew in a breath. She let it out. 2 months left. She had already calculated it. If she stood straight enough, if she always carried the tray at waist level, if she never leaned forward when pouring water, she could stretch it another 2 weeks, maybe 3. After that, she didn't know. Outside, someone rang the bell at the bar. A guest was asking for more wine. Delia opened the food box, ate 3 quick spoonfuls, closed the lid again, and put it in her locker. Then she stepped back out, and not one person among the 32 tables looked up at her. The night shift ended at 1 o'clock in the morning. But the shift manager called the entire staff to gather around the bar area before anyone had time to change. He was a man of about 40, wearing a white shirt wrinkled at the elbows, and he had a habit of talking, while looking at the stack of papers in his hand, instead of looking at the faces of the people listening. Delia stood at the edge of the group, near the kitchen door, still holding the silver tray she hadn't had time to return to the rack. On the tray were 12 wine glasses she had just dried from the dishwasher, arranged in 3 rows of 4, the closing task no one wanted to do, so she always took it. The manager told everyone to listen carefully, because he was only going to say it once. In 3 weeks on a Friday, the restaurant would be closed not for repairs, not for inspection, but for a private party. The entire 41st floor had been rented for the whole night. 200 guests. The guest list would be sent to reception on Wednesday morning, and no one was allowed to copy it, photograph it, or mention it outside the building. Whoever worked that shift would receive triple pay. Whoever didn't want to work had to give notice 48 hours in advance and wouldn't be penalized. A murmur went through the group. A young waitress asked what kind of party required closing the whole restaurant. The manager turned to the next page, and this time he lifted his head, but he didn't look at anyone in particular, only at the empty space above their heads, as if he were reading a line of text pasted to the ceiling. He said it was an engagement party. He said the bride's name was Corinne Ashgrove, daughter of the Ashgrove family on LaSalle Street, and if anyone didn't know who the Ashgroves were, then it was best not to ask and just do their job. Then he said the other person's name. He said that name in a perfectly ordinary way, as if it were anyone's name, as if he were reading the name of a fish supplier or a wine company. Rowan Blackwood. The tray left Delia's hands before she could understand what was happening. It didn't fall straight down. It tilted in the air, spun half a turn, and the 12 glasses slid off the silver surface in a slow arc, so slow that later she would still remember having time to see them fly. Having time to see the bar lights reflected on each slender stem before they all struck the tile floor at once. The sound wasn't one shatter. It was 12 shatters layered over one another, bouncing up to the ceiling, bouncing against the glass wall, then dying out. The entire restaurant floor went silent. More than a dozen people turned their heads to look at her. The manager lowered his stack of papers. Delia didn't apologize. She didn't stand still either. She dropped to her knees right where she was, both knees touching the tile floor still wet with mop water, and began picking up the pieces. She picked them up with her bare hands. She gathered the large shards first, placing them in her left palm, and when her palm was full, she emptied them onto the silver tray lying upside down beside her foot. Someone called her name. Someone said to leave it there, to get a broom first. She didn't hear. She bent lower, and her hair slipped free of its tie, falling forward to cover one side of her face. Her hands were trembling. Not lightly. They trembled the way a person trembles after missing a step in the dark, when the body has already reacted before the mind has had time to name the fear. A shard of glass sliced into the tip of her thumb. She saw the cut. She didn't stop. She kept picking up the pieces, and the smaller fragments she pushed into a pile with the edge of her hand, pushing them back and forth. Pushing more carefully than necessary, pushing longer than necessary, until Ezra Fallon came out of the kitchen, walked straight through the crowd, and placed his enormous hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He only stood there, his hand resting on her shoulder, until her breathing slowed. The manager told everyone to disperse, said the next shift would finish cleaning it up, said the cost of the 12 glasses would be deducted from this month's pay. He said the last sentence in the tone of someone reading a rule, not punishing anyone. Then he left. Delia remained kneeling on the floor for a little while longer. Ezra removed his hand from her shoulder, picked up the tray, and carried it into the kitchen, without asking a single question. She stood up. She went into the changing room, turned on the cold water, and rinsed the tip of her thumb under the stream until the cut stopped bleeding. In the mirror, she saw her own face, bloodless beneath the ceiling light. She wasn't afraid of losing her job. She had lost jobs 4 times in 6 years, and each time she had found another one before rent came due. Jobs were something she knew how to lose. For the past 3 years, she had avoided that name the way people avoid a locked door. The last train to Bridgeport ran at 1:40 in the morning, and Delia always sat in the last car, near the door, where there was an empty space with a metal wall she could lean her back against. From the station, it took 11 minutes to walk home. She had counted many times. Her apartment sat below ground, in the basement of a 3-story red brick building on Morgan Street. And to get inside, she had to go down 5 damp concrete steps and open an iron door whose lower hinge had rusted. Inside, there was 1 room, 1 kitchen, 1 long, narrow window set close to the ceiling, and that window opened at sidewalk level. So for the 2.5 years Delia had lived here, the only thing she saw when she looked up was the legs of people passing by. High heels in the morning, sneakers at noon, rubber boots when it rained. She knew who went to work early and who came home late. Knew the woman in the top apartment had a little dog because its nails tapped so clearly on the concrete. Knew the old man at the end of the street carried a cane on his left side because the sound of the cane always landed 1 beat out of step. She had never seen the face of any one of them. The heater had been broken since February. The landlord said he would fix it, then said so again in April, then stopped saying anything at all. Delia didn't call again. She bought 2 more blankets at the charity shop on Halsted Street, the same place where she had bought her shoes, and she learned that if she slept in wool socks, her toes wouldn't be numb in the morning. That night she got home close to 2 o'clock. She didn't turn on the ceiling light. She only switched on the small desk lamp in the corner, sat down on the edge of the bed, and took off her shoes very slowly, 1 at a time, because she knew if she removed them too quickly, the blood rushing down into her feet would make her want to cry. She sat like that for a long while, both hands resting on her knees, the thin cut on the tip of her thumb already sealed. Outside the narrow window, a pair of men's shoes passed by slowly, then disappeared. Then Delia stood and walked to the wooden cabinet against the wall. She opened the lowest door, the one whose hinge would squeak if it was opened too quickly, so she always opened it with both hands. Inside, beneath a stack of faded towels, was the tin box. It was smaller than a book, rectangular, painted blue with most of the paint already chipped away, and one corner had been dented inward, as if someone had once dropped it from somewhere high. On the lid there was still the faint drawing of a bouquet, and 3 letters that could no longer be read. Delia carried it out, set it on the table, and sat down on the only wooden chair in the apartment. She placed both hands on the lid of the box. Then she drew one hand back, lowered it, and rested it on her belly. She sat still that way for a very long time. The clock on the stove read 2:20. Inside the box were a leather-bound notebook, a brass key, and a very old scent that rose each time she opened the lid. The sweet, sharp smell of licorice her mother had sucked on through her final years to cover the taste of medicine. She didn't open the lid. She had already read it 2 months ago. She sat for a while longer, then stood, carried the box back to the cabinet, placed it beneath the stack of towels, and closed the door with both hands. She lay down on the bed without changing clothes. The ceiling was so low that if she sat up too suddenly, her hair would brush against it. She lay on her back, looked upward, and thought about the name the manager had read out in the middle of the restaurant as if it carried no weight at all. She thought about 200 guests. She thought about triple pay, and how triple pay for one night was nearly 2 ordinary weeks of wages, and about the prenatal bill she had postponed twice. She thought about how she would have to stand there, in a room with 200 people, carrying a tray level with her waist, and not leaning forward when pouring water. Then she thought about her mother. That woman had spoken that name exactly once in her life, on a November night, and Delia had spent the next 3 years never saying it aloud. She pulled the blanket up to her chin. Outside on the sidewalk, another pair of shoes passed by, and Delia closed her eyes. But she didn't sleep, and she knew very well that she would take the shift on Friday. 3 years earlier, in the winter when Delia was 24, her mother lived on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building on Emerald Street, exactly 4 blocks south of where Delia lived now. Maren Rourke was 49 then, and she had stopped working that summer, not because she wanted to, but because she could no longer stay on her feet through an entire shift. They called her illness by 3 words Delia had never once read aloud, and the doctor at the public clinic had told her, in the gentle voice of someone who had said that sentence far too many times, that at this stage, all they could do was make the patient hurt less. Delia took jobs in 3 places. In the morning, she washed dishes at a diner on 35th Street. In the afternoon, she packed boxes at a warehouse near the tracks. At night, she waited tables until midnight. She slept 3 hours, and she slept in the chair beside her mother's bed, because if her mother turned over at 4 o'clock in the morning, Delia had to be right there. In November, she took her mother's wedding ring to the pawn shop on Halsted Street. Her mother had taken it off 2 years earlier, because her finger had grown too thin, and it had been lying in a small porcelain dish on the nightstand. The shop owner looked at the ring through a magnifying glass for a long time, then gave her $320. Delia didn't bargain. She took the money, went straight to the pharmacy, and bought 2 weeks of pain medicine. Her mother didn't ask where the ring was. She only looked at the empty porcelain dish once, then turned her head toward the wall. On the night of November 20th, Chicago had its first snow of the season. Maren began running a fever around 9 o'clock in the evening, and by 11 o'clock, she was no longer calling her daughter by the right name. Delia called emergency services. She read the address, read her mother's age, read the name of the disease. Then the dispatcher asked for the insurance policy number. Delia recited that string of numbers from memory, because she had read it in 20 clinics over 2 years. There was a silence on the line. 3 seconds. She could still hear a keyboard clicking at the other end. Then the dispatcher said, "Mom, this policy has been canceled since October." Delia said that wasn't possible. She said her mother had paid in full for 19 years. The dispatcher said she could call back during business hours to file an appeal, and said that if she still wanted an ambulance, she would need to pay $900 in advance. Delia looked inside her wallet. There were $47 in it, and a card that had already reached its limit. She hung up. She stood in the middle of the room for 1 second, exactly 1 second, then wrapped her mother in both blankets, slid one arm under her back and the other under the bend of her knees, and lifted her. She was much lighter than Delia had expected. Delia went down 3 flights of stairs. The stairwell in the Emerald building was narrow, with a turn at every landing, and at the turn on the 2nd floor, Delia had to stop, lean her shoulder against the wall, breathe, then keep going. The downstairs door had no handle on the inside, so she had to turn her body and push it open with her back. Outside, the snow was falling thickly, and there was no wind. The night bus had already stopped running. There were no taxis on Emerald Street at 11 o'clock on a November night. The nearest hospital was to the east, 9 blocks away. Delia started walking. She walked in the middle of the road because the sidewalk was covered with snow, and she was afraid of slipping. She had gone 3 blocks when her left hand went numb, and she changed arms. She went another 2 blocks before her mother began to tremble, and Delia bent down, pressed her cheek to her mother's forehead, and spoke to her in the voice people use with a child, telling her they were almost there, that it was only a little farther. At the 7th block, Maren Rourke opened her eyes. She looked up, and this time she truly saw her daughter. She said Delia's name. Then she said, in a voice so small that Delia had to stop completely in the middle of the road and bend close to hear it, that if you meet a man named Blackwood, give him the box. Delia asked who. She asked a second time, then a third. Her mother didn't answer. Snow fell onto her face and didn't melt. Delia stood in the middle of the road, beneath a street lamp, exactly 2 blocks from the hospital gate, and she was still holding her mother in her arms when she understood that Maren was no longer breathing. She didn't put her down. She walked those last 2 blocks. The guard at the emergency entrance saw her from a distance and ran out, and when he took Maren from her arms, only then did Delia realize she had walked through the snow without any outdoor shoes on, wearing only the wool socks she wore every night when she slept in the chair beside her mother's bed, 1 floor above the restaurant, on the 42nd floor of Kingsley Tower. There was a room with no name on the building map and no number on the door. It wasn't used for meetings. It had no long table, no projector screen, no photographs on the walls. Inside the room there was only a dark wooden desk set slightly off toward the eastern wall, 2 chairs, a clock hanging in the middle of the wall opposite the doorway, and a low cabinet with a pitcher of water and 2 glass tumblers turned upside down. Bram Kessler had been sitting in that room for 40 minutes before the door opened. He sat in the chair with its back to the door, not because anyone had told him to sit there, but because the other chair had already been pulled out, turned slightly at an angle, facing directly toward the entrance. He was 51 years old, had worked for Blackwood Group for 9 years, and in those 9 years he had learned that no chair in this room was ever truly his. His 2 hands rested on his thighs, palms turned upward, and he didn't move them for the entire 40 minutes. When the door opened, Rowan Blackwood stepped inside and paused for exactly 1 beat on the threshold. In that moment, his eyes moved across the room in a sweep so quick that anyone not paying attention would have thought he was looking for the light switch. He counted. 1 man seated. 2 exits, one the door he had just come through, the other the narrow door leading to the fire stairs in the left corner. No one standing behind the column. Windows locked. He recorded all of it in the amount of time an ordinary person would use to clear his throat, then walked forward, pulled out the chair that had been turned at an angle, and sat down across from Bram Kessler. Back straight, face toward the door. He never sat any other way. Rowan was 34 years old. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open by 1 button. His hair was black and cut close, and he had the way of sitting that belonged to a man who had done manual labor for years before putting on fabric this expensive. His left wrist was bare. He wore no watch, no bracelet, nothing at all, and on that wrist there was a strip of skin paler than the rest. A mark 15 years of sunlight hadn't erased, the trace of a watch he had taken off at 19 and sold in a pawn shop near the harbor in exchange for medicine. He didn't say anything for the first 30 seconds. He stood, went to the low cabinet, filled a glass with water, came back and set it on the tabletop in front of Bram Kessler. He nudged it another 2 centimeters forward with the tip of his index finger. "Drink," he said. "Your throat's dry." Bram Kessler looked at the glass. Then he picked it up with both hands, because 1 hand was trembling too badly, and drank 3 swallows. A little water spilled at the corner of his mouth. He set the glass down and began saying that he could explain, that there had been a delayed payment on the transport side, that his daughter had needed surgery back in August, and the insurance had covered only part of it, that he had meant to pay it back before the end of the quarter. Rowan raised 1 finger, only 1 finger. Bram Kessler stopped in the middle of his sentence. Rowan turned his head, looked at the clock hanging on the wall opposite them, and spoke in a voice so low that Bram had to lean forward to hear it clearly. 30 seconds, he said. "Say the number. Don't say the reason." The second hand began to move. Bram Kessler opened his mouth. He said 1 number, then stopped, then said there was actually another amount from June. Then he talked about his daughter again, and he said he hadn't taken a penny from anyone in 9 years. and he began giving a second number, but between those two numbers he wedged in a promise, and then he mentioned his wife, and he said she knew absolutely nothing, that she even thought he had gotten a raise. Rowan didn't look at him. He looked at the clock. The second hand passed the mark for 2, passed the mark for 3. Bram Kessler spoke faster, and the faster he spoke, the fewer numbers there were, and by the 28th second, all he was saying again and again was the same sentence: "Please give me more time." The second hand touched the mark for 6. Rowan turned his head back. He looked at Bram Kessler for exactly 1 second. Then he lifted his eyes toward the door and gave a very slight nod, the kind of nod made by a man who has just confirmed that dinner is ready. The door opened. 2 men stepped in. The door closed. 7 minutes later, Rowan Blackwood stood alone in the room. He buttoned his suit jacket again, straightened the left sleeve, and looked down at the glass of water still 2/3 full on the table. He stood there for a while. Then he said, without looking at anyone, speaking to the empty chair across from him, in the calm voice of someone instructing a secretary to send a letter, "Give his wife the money. She doesn't know anything." Deacon Rule waited in the hallway until the door opened for the second time. Then he stepped inside without knocking. He was 33 years old, wearing a dark blue suit without a single crease, and he carried a thin file folder tucked under his left arm. Always his left arm, because his right hand had to remain free. He didn't look at the glass of water on the table. He didn't look at the empty chair. He had worked for Rowan Blackwood for 6 years, and in those 6 years, he had learned that whatever remained in a room after Rowan walked out of it was none of his business. He placed the file on the tabletop, opened it, and began reading the schedule in the flat, dry voice of a man reading the weather report. Tuesday, the meeting with the Port Management Board at Pier Number 7 had been moved to 10 o'clock in the morning. Wednesday, the internal audit of the freight fund, and he said this sentence without putting emphasis on a single word. Thursday, 2 people from the licensing committee would arrive, and they wanted to see the paperwork for the cold storage warehouse on the south side. Rowan listened, one hand resting on the table, his index finger tapping twice before going still. He didn't ask anything. Deacon turned to the last page and stopped. He straightened. "Ashgrove hasn't signed," he said. Rowan didn't raise his head. "Hasn't signed what?" "All of it. The equity transfer, the shareholder agreement, the appendix on Pier Number 9. His lawyer sent everything back last night, without changing a word, without objecting to a single clause. He just didn't sign." Rowan looked up. Deacon continued, and he spoke a little more slowly, because he knew this part wouldn't be easy to hear. He sent back 1 sentence through his secretary. He said his pen will work very well after his daughter has a ring on her hand. The room went silent. Outside the window, a helicopter moved across the northern skyline, and the sound of its blades reached the thick glass as a low, muffled noise, distant, almost unreal. Rowan Blackwood had never met Corinne Ashgrove outside of 4 dinners and 1 photo shoot for a finance magazine, and in all 5 times he had known exactly what he was buying and exactly what he was paying with. 3 seconds passed. Rowan picked up the glass of water on the table, stood, carried it to the low cabinet, poured what remained into the small sink, and turned the glass upside down. "Then there will be a wedding," he said. Deacon nodded. He folded the file shut and tucked it under his left arm. "Miss Ashgrove has reserved the 41st floor for the engagement party," he said. "Next Friday. 200 guests. She wants the press standing in the hallway instead of outside the gate." Rowan didn't turn around. "Let them stand in the hallway, and the guest list. She'll handle it herself." Deacon stopped at the door. He looked at the back of the man standing in front of the low cabinet, and he meant to say one more thing, something about Hollis Ashgrove, never asking for anything without already having a reason, a sentence he had been thinking about since last night, when he read the message from the secretary. But he didn't say it. He opened the door and stepped out. The private elevator for the 42nd floor took 52 seconds to descend. Deacon stood in the middle of the elevator car, beneath white light reflected on 4 polished metal walls, and watched the numbers on the digital panel fall. At the 31st floor, he took a phone from the inner pocket of his jacket. It wasn't the phone he used to call Rowan. It was smaller, older, and in its contacts there was only 1 number, with no name, no photograph. Only 11 digits he had memorized 2 years ago and had never once dialed. He opened the message window. He typed, He typed slowly with one thumb, and halfway through he stopped once to delete 3 words and write them again. By the 17th floor, he had finished. Deacon stood there, in the middle of the elevator car, and looked at the screen. He looked at it for a very long time. The floor indicator dropped to 12, to 9, to 6. His thumb rested on the send key and didn't press down. At the 3rd floor, he moved his finger to the right, pressed and held, and deleted the entire line 1 word at a time until the message window was empty. Then he turned off the screen, slipped the phone into his inner pocket, and when the elevator doors opened in the main lobby, Deacon Rule stepped out with the face of a man who had just come down from an ordinary meeting, on an ordinary afternoon, in a building where everything was exactly where it belonged. Deacon Rule's car was parked on the 2nd basement level, in space number 14, the same space he had used for all 6 years. He sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the engine. He sat there without moving for a while, both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the concrete wall in front of him, and down here underground. There was no sound at all except the steady hum of the ventilation fan somewhere above the ceiling. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, took out a leather wallet worn at the corners, and opened it. Inside, behind the building access card, tucked between 2 layers of leather, was a small printed photograph, the kind people print from the automatic machine at a pharmacy. The picture had been taken from far away, across a distance of about 15 meters, and it was slightly blurred in the left corner because someone had passed in front of the lens at the exact moment the photo was taken. In the photograph, a woman stood at the bar of a restaurant, one hand braced on the wooden surface, her head tilted slightly back. She was laughing, not the kind of laugh a server gives when a customer makes a joke. It was the laugh of someone who had just heard something truly funny, and her whole face had opened because of it. Deacon looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he turned it over. There was no writing on the back. He had taken it in March, from his seat at table 29, the only time he had dared set foot inside that restaurant, and he had stood up and left before she had the chance to turn back toward his table. 2 years earlier in a coffee shop on Morgan Street. Exactly 30 steps from her basement apartment, he had sat down in the chair across from her, because it was the only empty chair in the place. He had worn a canvas jacket and work boots. She had asked what he did. He said his name was Rule, that he worked in port logistics, more or less arranging freight into warehouses and signing paperwork, a job so boring it wasn't worth mentioning. She laughed and said she carried trays, which was just as boring. For the next 7 months, he never once wore a suit in front of her. He parked his car 2 blocks away from her building. He took off his watch before ringing her doorbell. On a November night, on a wet sidewalk after the rain, he went down on one knee between 2 puddles and asked her a question, and she stood there with her hand over her mouth, then nodded. He didn't buy a ring. He said he would buy one the next month. Then spring came. 3 days after she told him she was pregnant, Deacon came to that basement apartment at 7 o'clock in the evening, and he didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the room, beneath the low ceiling, and placed a thick envelope on the table. She looked at it. She asked what it was. He said it was money, and said she should leave Chicago, go south, go anywhere, and not tell anyone her new address. She asked again. He didn't answer. She pushed the envelope back toward him, pushing it with 2 fingers, slowly, until it touched the edge of the table on the other side. She said, "I'm keeping the baby." He stood motionless for a long time. Then he lifted a hand to adjust his collar, a gesture he made whenever he needed 1 second to swallow down something, and he said in a flat voice she had never heard him use before, "Then don't let me see you again. You don't understand who I work for." He turned and walked out. He didn't look back. And for the past 5 months, he didn't once ring that apartment bell, didn't once pass through Morgan Street, didn't once let his car park within a 4-block radius of where she lived. Deacon folded the wallet shut. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the same pocket that held the small phone with the 11 nameless digits. Then he started the engine. Leaving the basement, his car merged into traffic on Wacker Drive during rush hour, and the October sky over Chicago darkened very quickly, a little earlier each day, until the windows of the high-rises began lighting up in scattered patches, like an unfinished chessboard. Red light at the Wells Street intersection. Deacon stopped the car. He looked straight ahead. In his mind was a sentence he had heard less than an hour ago, A very short sentence, only 4 words, spoken by the very man he served in a room with no number on the door. Then there will be a wedding. The light turned green. The person behind him honked. Deacon Rule placed his hand on the gear shift, and in that moment he calculated very quickly, very precisely, exactly the way he had done for all 6 years, that the engagement party would be held on the 41st floor of Kingsley Tower. At the 41st floor of Kingsley Tower was Astor and Vine, and that Astor and Vine was the very restaurant where the woman in that photograph would have to stand for that entire night, carrying trays level with her waist, among 200 people. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, a week after the announcement, during the shift change. Delia had been on her feet since 10 o'clock that morning because she had taken an extra lunch shift to make up for the 12 glasses, and she hadn't eaten anything since a piece of bread at 7. She was carrying a bin of clean napkins from the storage room at the end of the staff hallway back to the prep room, the plastic bin rising as high as her chest, and she held it with both arms pressed against her body, walking along the wall because the hallway was narrow, and there was one spot where the floor tile had come loose, a place she always remembered to avoid. She had gone about 10 steps when everything in front of her began to darken from the edges inward, not going completely black, but filling with a gray shadow like rising water, and at the same time her ears filled with one long, high-ringing sound. She stopped. She put a hand against the wall. She thought very clearly that she only needed to stand still for 10 seconds and it would pass, because it had passed that way 4 times before. But this time it didn't pass. The plastic bin slipped from her hands and tipped sideways onto the floor, and dozens of white napkins burst out, spreading across the gray tile, and Delia slid down the wall to the floor, her knees folding first, then her shoulder touching the wall, then her whole body lying there on its side, one cheek pressed against the cold tile among the white napkins. The kitchen door flew open at the far end of the hallway. Ezra Fallon ran toward her. He ran heavily, the way a 58-year-old man, nearly 6'3", and unused to running for 15 years would run, and he dropped the towel draped over his shoulder along the way, without noticing. He knelt beside her. He didn't shake her. He slipped his large hand under the back of her neck, lifted her head a few centimeters off the tile, and called her name twice, his voice not loud, not panicked, only the voice of someone waking another person in the morning. Delia, Delia. He raised his other hand, turned her wrist over, and searched for her pulse with 3 fingers, and he found it. He breathed out. He took off the kitchen jacket he was wearing, folded it in half, and placed it beneath her head. He didn't call anyone. He didn't shout for help. He only crouched there, one hand holding her shoulder so she wouldn't roll onto her back, and he looked toward the end of the hallway, where a door led out to the elevator lobby for the office floors above. That door opened. A man stepped through. He wore a charcoal gray suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open by one button, and he walked with the steady rhythm of a man who knew exactly how many minutes he had left. There was nothing in his hands. His left wrist wore nothing. He came forward, and when he was about 4 steps away, he looked down. He saw a woman lying on her side on the tile among the white napkins. He saw a silver-haired man kneeling beside her, one hand supporting the back of her neck. He saw the plastic bin tipped over, the kitchen jacket folded in half beneath her head, and that woman's hand loosely curled, her thumb marked with a thin cut that had sealed over a few days earlier. He saw all of it in the amount of time an ordinary person would use to blink twice. Then he stepped past. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down. His heels struck evenly against the tile, passing the place where Delia lay, passing 2 white napkins lying directly in his path, and he stepped exactly 1 pace to the left to avoid trampling them, the sidestep of someone avoiding a puddle on the sidewalk. Ezra Fallon lifted his head. He watched the back of that charcoal gray jacket. He said nothing. At the end of the hallway, the man stopped in front of the elevator doors and pressed the button. He stood there with his back turned, both hands hanging at his sides, and he didn't look back once. The elevator doors opened. Rowan Blackwood stepped inside, turned, and pressed a number on the control panel. For 3 seconds before the doors closed, he stood looking straight out into the hallway, looking toward the 2 people at the other end, and his face didn't change. The elevator doors shut. On Friday night, the 41st floor of Kingsley Tower was no longer a restaurant. All 32 dining tables had been removed and replaced with tall round tables without chairs, and in the center of the floor, beneath the ceiling, 3 crystal chandeliers had been lowered 1 meter below their usual height, so their light would settle over people's heads instead of scattering upward across the ceiling. A string quartet sat in the northeast corner, facing into the room, their backs to the glass wall overlooking the lake. 200 people stood scattered across the floor, and at this level of money, no one spoke loudly, so the sound covering everything was music and glasses touching glasses, a steady, rounded noise with no sharp edges. At 15 minutes to 9, the main door opened. The string quartet was playing the 11th measure of a piece no one was listening to. The first violinist looked up. Only one very quick glance, no more than half a second, but his bow touched the string a quarter beat too early, and all 4 musicians had to draw out the next note a little longer to catch up with one another. None of the 200 guests noticed. But the quartet knew, and for the remaining 2 hours of that night, they played noticeably softer. Rowan Blackwood paused for one beat on the threshold. His eyes swept across the room, that gaze moving from left to right, stopping at the western emergency exit, stopping at the southern kitchen door, stopping at 2 men in suits standing near the windows whose faces he didn't recognize. Then he stepped inside. At a round table near the walkway, 3 men were standing with their hips resting against the tall stools. As Rowan passed, all 3 straightened at the same time. No one called his name. No one greeted him. They only stood upright, as if an invisible string ran from their shoulders to the ceiling, and someone had just pulled it. One of the 3 was still holding a glass of wine, and he lowered it to the tabletop without finishing it. In the hallway behind them, where the reporters were allowed to stand, a young man managed to slip half his body through the doorway and raise his camera. He aimed the lens at Rowan, his index finger resting on the shutter. Rowan didn't stop. He only turned his head, and he looked straight into that lens, looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, without glaring, without frowning, without making any gesture that could be captured as a photograph with meaning. The reporter lowered the camera. He stepped back into the hallway, and he didn't raise it a second time for the rest of the night. In the middle of the room, Corinne Ashgrove turned around. She was 31 years old, with platinum hair cut to shoulder length, and she stood in the position from which anyone entering through the main door would have to see her first, a spot she had chosen at 3 o'clock that afternoon when she came to inspect the floor. She placed her hand on Rowan's elbow when he came close, and she left it there a few seconds longer than necessary, just enough time for the people standing nearby to see. Beside her was her father. Hollis Ashgrove was 62 years old, almost a full head shorter than Rowan, with white hair combed back, and he had the face of a man who had slept well for 40 years. He held out his hand. Rowan shook it. Hollis held on to that hand for one beat longer, and he tilted his head to one side, looking up at Rowan with the almost affectionate curiosity of someone studying an old photograph. "You left Chicago when you were 19, he said. His voice was light, pleasant, and he said it at exactly the volume that only Rowan could hear. "Back then, I heard a few things from down at the docks. Then you disappeared. For 9 years, no one said your name anymore." He released Rowan's hand. "To be honest, I thought you were dead." Rowan didn't pull his hand back right away. He left it there for one more second, then lowered it. The string quartet moved into another piece. On the south side of the room, the steel kitchen door opened, and a server stepped out with a tray of wine, moving along the edge of the floor, carrying the tray level with her waist. "Almost," Rowan said. Delia arrived 1 hour and 15 minutes before her shift began. She changed in the empty locker room, in front of the long mirror mounted on the metal cabinet, and she put on the uniform 2 sizes too large for her, the one she had asked to exchange back in July with the excuse that the old one had torn along the shoulder seam. She tied her apron. She pulled the strings out a little farther and tied them tighter, pulling until the black fabric pressed close against her body, and the curve beneath that fabric disappeared from the mirror. Then she opened her locker, took out a small cloth bag, and from inside that cloth bag, she took out the tin box. She held it with both hands. She stood like that for a while, in the middle of the room washed white by the harsh ceiling light, then slipped it into the pocket of her apron, the wide pocket in front where she normally kept her pen and order pad. It was heavy there. She could feel it touching her body every time she moved. For the first 2 hours, Delia didn't go near the gift table. She did her job. She carried wine from the bar out onto the floor, collected empty glasses, wiped a streak of water from the stone floor, with a paper towel when someone spilled, and moved along the edge of the room, close to the wall, the tray level with her waist. The gift table was set in the northwest corner, about 3 meters long, covered in white cloth, and on top of it the boxes had already been stacked in 2 tiers. There were boxes wrapped in gold paper and tied with silk ribbons. There was a vermilion red box, with 2 raised initials on the lid, that even someone who knew nothing would recognize. There was a square orange leather box, set apart in the center, as if the giver had instructed the staff to place it there. There was a thick envelope with a handwritten card, propped against a bottle of wine packed inside a wooden box. Delia passed that table the first time at 10:15, carrying a tray of 8 glasses, her eyes looking straight ahead. She passed it the second time at 10:40, the tray empty, and this time she slowed by half a step, just enough to see that a man was standing near the gift table, holding a glass of wine, talking with 2 others, and he was standing exactly where she had meant to go. She kept walking. She went into the kitchen, stood beside the sink for 60 seconds, then came back out. She passed it the third time at 5 minutes to 11. By then, the string quartet had just paused between 2 pieces, and in that silence the sound of conversation rose a little, then lowered again. The 3 men had left. There was no one left in the northwest corner. Delia stopped in front of the gift table. She set the tray on the edge of the table and held it with her left hand. Her right hand went into the pocket of her apron. She took out the box. It was smaller than everything else lying on that white cloth. The blue paint on the lid had almost all chipped away, and one corner was dented inward, and beneath the light of the 3 crystal chandeliers, that dent cast a small, distorted shadow over the cloth. She set it down. She didn't place it among the others. She placed it at the very outer edge, closest to the rim of the table, beside the foot of the orange leather box, and she turned it slightly to make it straight. Then she drew her hand back, picked up the tray with both hands, and stepped back once. She stood there for 2 more seconds. No longer. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen door, and she didn't look back once. 10 minutes later, Corinne Ashgrove came to the gift table. She came because a friend wanted to take a photograph, and she stood there at an angle, one hand resting on the edge of the table, her chin lifted slightly, waiting for the click of the camera. After the photograph had been taken and her friend turned away, Corinne remained where she was. She looked along the length of the table from left to right, slowly, with the gaze of a person taking inventory. Then she stopped at the very outer edge. She bent down and picked up the tin box. It was lighter than she had expected. She turned it over. There was no card, no ribbon, no giver's name anywhere. She turned it again, more slowly this time, and she ran her thumb over the dented corner, over the chipped paint, over the faded drawing of a bouquet that had almost vanished from the face of the tin. Corinne Ashgrove narrowed her eyes. By 11:20, a small microphone had been set up in the middle of the floor, near the gift table, and the string quartet stopped playing. Corinne Ashgrove stepped toward it, still holding the tin box in her hand. She tapped the head of the microphone twice with her fingernail, and that tapping echoed through the room, and 200 people turned around. She thanked everyone for coming. She said a few words about love and about a new chapter, sentences she had written in her phone that afternoon, and she read them smoothly, her eyes moving across each cluster of guests so she wouldn't leave anyone out. Then she said she wanted to thank everyone for all the gifts. She said she had looked over the gift table and was deeply touched. Then she raised the tin box, holding it between the tips of 2 fingers, holding it a little away from her body, in exactly the way people hold something they have just picked up from the floor of a train. "But it seems," she said, and she waited for the laughter. Already, waiting in the room, someone thinks a cookie tin picked out of a scrapyard is a worthy gift. The laughter broke first at the nearest table, then spread to the left, then covered the whole room. Someone clapped twice and stopped. Corinne turned the box in her hand, lifting the dented corner toward the crowd so everyone could see it. "No card," she said. "No name. The paint is peeling. I suppose this one passed through a few owners before it made its way here." Another wave of laughter followed. Then she lowered her hand, and she began sweeping her eyes across the room. She wasn't looking at the guests. She was looking along the edge of the floor, along the wall, toward the people in black uniforms waiting with trays in their hands. There were 4 servers there. She looked at each one, and she stopped on the third, on a woman standing about 4 steps from the kitchen door, holding a tray pressed against her body with both hands. "You," Corinne said into the microphone. "Step up here." The whole room turned to look. Delia didn't move for 1 second. Then she stepped forward. She walked from the edge of the floor into the middle of the room. Through the open space 200 people had shifted aside to give her, and she still held the tray in front of her chest with both hands, because she didn't know where to put it and no one had told her. She stopped 2 steps away from Corinne. Corinne looked her up and down. "This is yours?" she said, holding up the box. Delia nodded louder. "People can't hear you." "Yes, Mom." "How long have you worked here?" 4 years. Corinne tilted her head slightly. 4 years on the 41st floor. 4 years seeing what people give each other. Her eyes dropped to Delia's uniform, to the apron, and she narrowed them exactly the way she had narrowed them at the gift table 10 minutes earlier. "You're wearing this much too loose," she said. "It looks sloppy." Then she reached out and took hold of the 2 apron strings hanging at Delia's hips. She gave one hard pull. The knot came undone. The black apron slipped down, sliding along the uniform, and fell onto the marble floor in a crumpled heap of fabric at her feet. The 7-month pregnant belly was exposed. The room went utterly still. It went completely silent. Silent in the way 200 people can only become silent, when all of them understand something in the same moment. And that silence lasted about 3 seconds before breaking into a swell of sound rising from every side, a sound that held laughter, that held someone drawing in a breath. Somewhere behind them, a glass came down too hard on a tabletop. Delia didn't bend down to pick up the apron. She stood straight, both hands still holding the tray in front of her chest, and she didn't raise a hand to cover herself. From the pocket of the apron lying on the floor, a piece of paper had slipped out. It was small, folded into quarters, so wrinkled that the creases had worn white. Corinne bent down and picked it up. She opened it with one hand, glanced over it, then laughed and brought it close to the microphone. "Ah," she said, "a list." She read aloud and her voice rang through the room, every word clear. Marin, Ada, June, Nell. She lowered the paper, looked at Delia and shrugged. "Have you chosen yet?" The whole room laughed. Some laughed out loud. Some only let out a breath through their noses before turning to whisper to the person beside them. Corinne released the paper. It fell to the marble floor, flipping once in the air and landed face up. The 4 names turned straight toward the ceiling, about 1 handspan from the toe of Delia's shoe. Delia looked at it. She didn't pick it up. Corinne turned back toward the microphone, and as she turned, she lifted the tin box to shoulder height, then opened her hand. The box fell straight onto the marble floor. The lid sprang open. The steel kitchen door slammed against the wall. Ezra Fallon rushed out, still wearing his kitchen jacket, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he walked straight through the open space in the middle of the floor, with the stride of a man who had already decided everything before taking his first step. He made it 4 steps. 2 guards in black suits moved out from both sides, one blocking him from the front, the other circling behind, and the man in front placed his palm against Ezra's chest. Ezra stopped. He didn't push the man's hand away. He stood there, a full head taller than both of them, and looked over their shoulders toward the center of the room, and his right hand closed and opened again. The guard said something very softly. Ezra didn't answer. He didn't take his eyes off Delia. Corinne Ashgrove hadn't turned to look at the kitchen door. She was still standing at the microphone, and she went on speaking, and her voice had changed now, had shed the playful tone from moments before, and become as clear and precise as someone reading the clauses of a contract. "I think everyone here should know something," she said into the microphone. "This restaurant doesn't hire pregnant women. That's an occupational safety rule. Standing 10 hours a shift, carrying heavy objects, working near a hot kitchen," she turned toward Delia. "You signed the health declaration back in April, didn't you?" Delia didn't answer. "You lied to keep your job," Corinne said. "You hid it for half a year. You wore a uniform twice your size. You stood here in my family's restaurant and deceived everyone. Then tonight you walked over to the gift table and put down a rusty tin box." She pointed down at the marble floor, where the tin box lay tilted with its lid sprung open. "Were you trying to beg?" she said. "Did you think that if you left something pathetic enough here tonight, someone would feel sorry for you tomorrow morning and let you stay?" Not one of the 200 people said anything. The laughter had died out without anyone noticing when. At the round table to the west, a middle-aged woman set down her glass of wine and looked down at the tabletop. Near the window, Two men turned their backs and pretended to look at the lake. Delia Rourke stood straight. She was still holding the silver tray in front of her chest with both hands, and now everyone could see why she had been holding it there for the past few months. She didn't lower the tray. She didn't raise it either. She didn't lift a hand to cover herself. She didn't step back even once. Her face was white, but it didn't tremble. Her eyes weren't red. She looked straight at Corinne Ashgrove. And she looked that way long enough for the room to begin feeling uncomfortable. Long enough for someone to clear his throat. Long enough for Corinne, who had never had to wait for anyone to answer her in all 31 years of her life, to frown slightly. Then Delia opened her mouth. She said only 6 words. She said them in her normal voice. No louder, no softer. The same voice she used when asking guests whether they wanted more water. And because the room had gone that silent, all 200 people heard her clearly. I did not come to beg. Then she fell silent. She didn't explain. She didn't say one more word. She stood there, in the middle of the marble floor, beneath the 3 chandeliers that had been lowered by 1 meter, with the silver tray in her hands, with the apron crumpled at her feet, with a piece of paper bearing 4 names lying face up a handspan from the toe of her shoe, and with a tin box dented at one corner, lying tilted on the stone floor. Its lid sprung open, and inside that box, something still lay exactly where it had always been, untouched by anyone. 4 meters away, slightly behind, at the edge of the ring of people, Rowan Blackwood stood still. He had been standing there since Corinne stepped up to the microphone. He wasn't holding a glass. His hands hung at his sides. He wasn't looking at his fiancée. He wasn't looking at Ezra Fallon, who was being held back by 2 of his own men at the kitchen door. He wasn't looking at Hollis Ashgrove, who stood a few steps away with a very small smile at the corner of his mouth. Rowan Blackwood was looking at the woman standing in the middle of the room. He looked at the silver tray held across her chest. He looked at her 2 hands, and he saw the thin sealed cut on the tip of her right thumb, and in one very brief moment, a moment no one among the 200 people there noticed, something crossed Rowan Blackwood's face, crossed it very quickly, like the shadow of a bird passing over water, then vanished completely. Rowan Blackwood stepped out from the edge of the ring of people. He took 3 steps, and by the 3rd step, the whole room realized where he was going, and the last remaining whisper died completely. Corinne turned her head. She opened her mouth as if to say something, perhaps his name, perhaps some joke meant to draw him back toward her. She didn't have time. Rowan walked past her without looking. He went to where the tin box lay tilted on the stone floor, about 2 handspans from the toe of Delia's shoe, and stopped before it. Then he bent down. He didn't kneel. He only lowered himself halfway onto one knee, reached out, and picked up the box with both hands, one hand supporting the bottom, the other holding the lid that had sprung loose from its hinge. He did it slowly, carefully, with the care of someone lifting an egg, and when he raised it to chest height, when the tin lid lifted a little farther from the body of the box and the air inside escaped, a scent rose up. It wasn't strong. It was only a very thin thread of fragrance, sweet and sharp, the smell of a kind of candy that drugstores had stopped selling long ago. The smell that had clung to the wax paper lining inside the box through all those years, and now, beneath the light of 3 crystal chandeliers, among the smell of perfume and wine and floor polish from 200 people, found its way out. Licorice. Rowan Blackwood stood motionless. He stood motionless in that half-lowered posture, one knee not yet straightened, both hands supporting the tin box before his chest, his head slightly bowed. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't widen them either. He only stopped, completely, exactly where he stood, and for the next 2 seconds, not one muscle in his body moved, not even his chest. Behind him, Hollis Ashgrove frowned. Near the kitchen door, Ezra Fallon stopped clenching his hand. In the middle of the room, Delia Rourke remained where she was with the tray held against her chest, and she looked down at the crown of the man who was half kneeling at her feet, and she didn't understand what was happening. 15 years folded into a single breath. Rowan inhaled. He stood up. He rose slowly, left leg first, and when he had straightened, he still held the box with both hands at chest height, and he didn't look at anyone. He turned and took 3 steps toward the gift table, to the long stretch of white cloth, and he set the box down there, in an empty space between the gold paper boxes and the square orange leather box. Then he stood straight and removed the tin lid completely. He placed the lid to one side. Inside the box was a notebook. Its cover was leather, dark brown, and the surface had cracked into 3 long parallel lines, the kind of cracking that comes when leather has dried through many winters. It was small, fitting into the palm of a hand, and the paper edges inside had yellowed and were no longer even, some pages sticking out, some set farther in. A rubber band had once been wrapped around it, but it had rotted and snapped, leaving only 2 ends lying across the cover. Beside the notebook, resting in the corner of the box, was a brass key. Rowan Blackwood didn't pick up the notebook first. He reached in, lifted that key with 2 fingers, and turned it once beneath the light. The brass had darkened into a greenish-brown at the head, but at the teeth it was still bright, because the metal there had been worn down by being fitted into a lock thousands of times. He still kept that lock in the safe on the 42nd floor. He set the key down on the white cloth. He set it down very gently, and the contact between brass and the wooden tabletop beneath the cloth made a small, clean click, and in a room that's silent, dozens of the nearest people heard it. Someone whispered, asking what was happening. No one answered. Corinne Ashgrove stepped closer by 1 pace. She looked down at the tabletop, at the cracked leather notebook, at the tarnished key lying beside it, and she said Rowan's name once, softly, in the voice of someone trying to pull another person out of sleep. He didn't hear her. Rowan Blackwood reached into the tin box a second time, and he lifted out the notebook. The notebook opened to the first page without him needing to search, because its spine had been broken at that very spot for a long time. The handwriting belonged to a woman writing with a ballpoint pen, small strokes slanting to the right, and in a few places the ink had blurred into small round stains that time had not erased. February 3rd. The boy has a fever of 40 degrees. I don't dare call a doctor. If he dies here, I won't forgive myself. Rowan read that line twice. Then he turned to the next page. Beneath it were a few more lines from that same day, written later, the ink darker, perhaps with a different pen. He was lying in the pile of pallets in row C. I found him close to 2 o'clock in the morning, because I heard coughing. He couldn't speak. He only grabbed my wrist and shook his head, and I understood that he didn't want me to call anyone. I pulled him into the staff break room. No one goes in there from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. The next page was February 4th, then the 5th, then the 6th. 1 page for each day, and every page was packed with writing from the top edge to the bottom edge, with no margin left. She had written down everything. She wrote down the money spent on fever medicine, $1.75, and she wrote that she had bought it at the pharmacy, 3 blocks from the warehouse, instead of the nearest one because the clerk there knew her face. She wrote that on the 3rd day he began to eat, and that she had cooked chicken soup at home and brought it in a thermos, and she wrote that she had poured the soup into the thermos at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 2 o'clock in the morning, it was still warm. She wrote that on the 5th day he began to speak. She didn't write down what he said. She only wrote 1 line, shorter than all the other lines on that page. He went home and his father was no longer there. Rowan stood before the gift table, both hands holding the notebook open at chest height, and he didn't turn the page for a long while. Behind him, 200 people stood still. No one stepped closer. The 6th day, the 7th day. She wrote that he slept for 6 straight hours, and that she had sat in the corner of the break room on a plastic chair to keep watch. And she wrote that her shift ended at 5 o'clock in the morning, but she had stayed 2 more hours and told the person on duty that she had to clean the restroom again. On the 8th day, she wrote that he asked why she was doing it. She wrote that she couldn't answer, so she told him to eat. On the 9th day, she wrote that 2 men came to the warehouse asking about a boy 19 years old, and she had told them she only cleaned, that she didn't pay attention to who came and went, and after they left, she had to sit down for several minutes because her knees couldn't hold her up. On the 10th day, she wrote that he could walk around the room by himself, and that he kept standing at the window looking toward the docks, and that she had told him to stay away from the window. Then Rowan turned to the last page. February 13th. He's gone. He left at 4 o'clock in the morning, walked to the bus station. I gave him $4,000, everything I had. I'll tell my daughter her mother lost her wallet. She'll never know. She doesn't need to know. Beneath that line was a blank space of about 3 centimeters, and in that blank space she had written 1 more sentence in a thinner stroke, perhaps written at another time, perhaps many days later. I didn't ask his name. Now it's too late. Rowan Blackwood stood motionless. He read that line, and he read it again, and he ran his thumb over it once, very lightly, as if checking whether it was real. Then he turned to the next page. There was no next page. In that place there was only a torn strip of paper running along the spine of the notebook, about 1/2 centimeter wide, the torn edge uneven, some places jutting out, some places sinking in, the kind of tear made when a sheet of paper is ripped out by hand rather than cut with a blade. On that remaining strip of paper, closest to the spine, a few marks of ink still clung there. Half of some letter, a punctuation mark. Nothing could be read. Rowan stared at that torn edge for a long time. After that, he kept turning. The rest of the notebook was blank paper, more than 30 blank pages that had never been written on, and they flipped beneath his fingers with a dry, rustling sound in the silent room. He closed the notebook. He set it down on the white cloth beside the brass key, and he placed both hands on the edge of the gift table, and he stood that way, his back turned to the 200 people, his head lowered, his shoulders unmoving. From where Delia stood, all she could see was the back of that charcoal gray jacket. She saw that it didn't move. Then she saw it move once, very slightly, a small rise and fall of both shoulders, the rise and fall of a man who had just drawn in a breath and couldn't let it out right away. Rowan Blackwood released the edge of the gift table. He turned around. He turned slowly, and when he was facing the room, 200 people saw his face, and not one of them recognized it. It wasn't angry, it wasn't in pain. It was simply empty in the way a person's face becomes empty when everything he has believed about himself has just been pulled out of his chest in the span of 4 minutes. He didn't look at Corinne. He didn't look at Hollis. He looked straight at the woman standing in the middle of the floor, with the silver tray held against her chest. He took 2 steps toward her, then stopped, and he opened his mouth, and the voice that came out was not a voice anyone in that room had ever heard him use. It was very small. It was so small that the people standing at the outer ring had to lean forward. "What was your mother's name?" Delia didn't understand why he was asking that. She looked at him. She looked at the cracked leather notebook lying on the white cloth behind him. She looked at the brass key. Then she answered, and her voice was very small too, because she had been standing there too long and her throat had gone dry. "Marin Rourke." Rowan Blackwood didn't say thank you. He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't say that he knew her mother, that she had saved him, that he owed her a life. He didn't say any of the things that the 200 people in that room, or 200,000 other people in this city, would have said if they had been standing where he stood. The first sentence that left his mouth was 4 words. She had a name. No one understood. Corinne turned to look at her father. Hollis Ashgrove didn't look back at his daughter. He was looking at Rowan, and for the first time that evening, the very small smile at the corner of his mouth had gone out. At the kitchen door, the 2 guards had somehow already removed their hands from Ezra Fallon's chest, and all 3 men stood beside one another like 3 strangers waiting for the same train. Rowan lifted his right hand. He meant to do something with it, perhaps point at the notebook, perhaps extend it forward. He couldn't. That hand was trembling. It trembled clearly, trembling from the wrist down, that bare wrist with nothing on it, and he looked down at it with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the hand no longer belonged to him. 200 people saw Rowan Blackwood's hand shake. He lowered it. He brought it to his chest, and he unbuttoned his suit jacket, the only button he had fastened again in a room with no number on the door on the 42nd floor. He took it loose, and he didn't remove the jacket completely. He only let the 2 sides hang open. Then he took 1 more step toward Delia. Then he knelt. He went down on 1 knee, his right knee touching straight against the cold marble floor, and he bowed his head, and he placed his right hand, the hand that was still trembling, on his left knee. The room did not make a sound. There was no gasp, no glass falling. In the hallway behind them, the young reporter lowered his hand into his jacket pocket, touched the camera, then withdrew his hand and left it there. Not one person among the 200 on the 41st floor of Kingsley Tower that night raised a camera. Rowan Blackwood spoke, and he spoke without lifting his head. 11 days, he said. I was 19 years old. I was lying in a warehouse by the lake, and I had already thought about dying there, and it seemed all right to me. A woman who cleaned the night shift found me close to 2 o'clock in the morning. She pulled me into the staff break room. She hid me for 11 days. He stopped. He breathed in. I ate food she cooked at home and carried in a thermos. I slept beneath the jacket she took off and laid over me. 2 men came to the warehouse asking about me, and she stood in front of the break room door and said she only cleaned, that she didn't pay attention to who came in or went out. He raised his head. He looked at Delia. On the last night, she gave me $4,000. I took it and I walked to the bus station at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I didn't look back once. His throat moved. I ate her food. I slept under her jacket. I took her money. He said the last sentence very slowly, separating every word, and he said it while still looking straight into the eyes of the woman standing before him, and in those 11 days I never once asked her name. Delia Rourke stood still. She didn't say a word. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, didn't reach out. She only stood there, both hands still holding the silver tray against her chest, in the middle of the marble floor, beneath the 3 crystal chandeliers, with the crumpled apron at her feet and a piece of paper bearing 4 names lying face up a handspan from the toe of her shoe. And in that silence, so long that later many of the people present still couldn't agree on how long it had lasted, the whole room stood listening as a man who had never bowed his head before anyone learned how to say the name of a woman who had died 3 years earlier, in the snow, exactly 2 blocks from the hospital gate. Rowan Blackwood stood up. He brushed his knee once with the back of his hand, a mechanical gesture. Then he turned and looked at Corinne Ashgrove. He didn't shout. He had never shouted at anyone in his life, and those who knew him understood that when Rowan Blackwood wanted to say something truly serious, he lowered his voice even further. And that was exactly what he did now. "You just threw onto the floor," he said. "The only thing in this world that ever saved my life." Corinne opened her mouth. She looked around, and she saw 200 faces looking at her, and she did what she had always done throughout the 31 years of her life, whenever that many people were looking at her. She smiled. That smile didn't reach her eyes. "Rowan," she said, and she tried to soften her voice, tried to pull the whole room back toward some joke that might still be salvaged. "You're making too much of an old box." He stepped forward. He reached out, took her left hand, and with 2 fingers, his thumb and forefinger, he removed the engagement ring from her ring finger. He didn't yank it. He wasn't rough. He wasn't gentle either. He removed it exactly the way someone removes a label still clinging to an item returned to the warehouse, and the ring slipped over the joint of her finger with a very faint scrape, and Corinne let it be taken off because in that moment she couldn't think of a single thing to do. Rowan turned. He took 3 steps toward Delia Rourke, who was still standing in the middle of the floor, with the silver tray held across her chest. He didn't speak to her. He didn't look into her eyes. He only extended his hand and placed the ring on the surface of the silver tray, set it right in the center, and the stone on it caught the chandelier light and threw a small speck of brightness across the ceiling before it disappeared. Then he turned back toward the room. "Return it to the Ashgrove house," he said. Along with the investment, someone drew in a breath. At the round table to the west, a man set down his glass and stepped back half a pace, and the person beside him stepped back as well, and just like that, an entire patch of people drifted away without anyone telling them to, and in the newly opened space, Hollis Ashgrove stepped forward. He walked unhurriedly. He didn't look at his daughter, who stood rooted to the floor with her left hand hanging at her side. He walked straight to Rowan, stopped beside him, slightly behind him, raised one hand and placed it on Rowan Blackwood's shoulder. That hand settled very lightly. It rested on the charcoal gray fabric of the suit jacket, the thumb pressing in just a little, and it remained there a little longer than necessary. It was the gesture of a father placing his hand on his son's shoulder at a wedding. It was also the gesture of an owner placing his hand on the shoulder of an animal he had paid money to buy. Hollis Ashgrove wasn't angry. His face was still the face of a man who had slept well for 40 years. He tilted his head a little closer, and he spoke at just the right volume for the people nearest him to hear, and there were about 15 of them standing nearest him that night, and all of them would later remember every word. "Do you know why I chose you, Rowan?" He wasn't asking. He was only speaking. "Not because of your money. There are 4 people in this city richer than you, and I sit down to dinner with all 4 of them at least once a year." His thumb pressed a little deeper into the shoulder of the jacket. "I chose you because you were the only man in this city, without a family for me to threaten." He released his hand. He turned slowly, and he looked over Rowan's shoulder, out into the middle of the marble floor, where a 27-year-old woman stood with a silver tray before her chest and a diamond ring lying in the center of it. Hollis Ashgrove lowered his eyes. He said nothing at all. He only looked down, and that gaze stopped for exactly 3 seconds in one place, and everyone standing nearby knew exactly what he was looking at, and not one of them dared to breathe. "Until today," he said. Then he lifted his head, smiled at Rowan with the very same smile he had worn while shaking his hand at 15 minutes to 9, adjusted his cuff, and walked away. He passed Corinne without stopping. He walked toward the main door, and the crowd parted to let him through, and he vanished into the hallway where the reporters were waiting without understanding anything at all. Rowan Blackwood didn't turn his head to watch him go. He remained where he was, and for one very brief moment he looked down at his own right hand. It was no longer trembling. It closed into a fist. The party broke up close to 1 o'clock in the morning, and it broke up in the way parties like that always break up when no one knows how to behave anymore, meaning small groups quietly left one by one, no one saying goodbye to the hosts, no one saying thank you. Ezra Fallon picked up the apron from the floor and folded it. He also picked up the crumpled piece of paper folded into quarters, brushed dust from one corner, and tucked it into the pocket of his kitchen jacket without opening it to read. By 2 o'clock, the cleaning staff had finished wiping down the stone floor, and only the white cloth remained on the gift table. Delia was asked by one of Rowan's men to go up to the 42nd floor. She followed. She was still wearing the uniform 2 sizes too large, without the apron, and she carried the silver tray because no one had taken it back from her, and the ring was still lying in the very center of it. The office on the 42nd floor was larger than the room, with no number on the door, with one glass wall looking out over Lake Michigan, and at this hour the lake was only an absolute stretch of black beneath the points of light from the buildings along the shore. Rowan Blackwood stood beside the window, his back turned. On the desk behind him were the tin box, the leather-bound notebook, and the brass key, all 3 lying side by side. There were 2 chairs in the room. Delia didn't sit. Rowan didn't invite her to sit. She set the tray on the edge of the desk, and the ring slid to one side, then stopped. He heard the sound of metal touching wood. He didn't turn around right away. He stood there a while longer, looking out at that darkness beyond the glass, and when he turned, she saw that he had taken off his suit jacket and draped it over the back of a chair, that the sleeves of his shirt were rolled to his elbows, and that his left wrist was still bare like that. "Sit down," he said. Delia didn't move. He didn't repeat himself. "Someone will call you tomorrow," he said, "about your employment contract, about insurance, about everything you should have had 4 years ago. You don't have to go back to the 41st floor anymore if you don't want to." She said nothing. He walked to the desk. He placed 2 fingertips on the cover of the notebook, not opening it, only touching it. "You carried this in your apron pocket all evening," he said. "You passed the gift table 3 times. She still said nothing. Rowan Blackwood looked up, and then he did something that no one in 6 years of working under him had ever seen him do, something he himself didn't understand why he was doing at 2 o'clock in the morning, in a room with only 2 people, after everything had ended and no one was left to witness it. He said a sentence he could have carried in silence for the rest of his life without a single soul ever knowing. "2 weeks ago," he said. "You were lying on the hallway floor. I stepped over you." The room went silent. Delia Rourke stood in the middle of the room, one hand still resting lightly on the edge of the silver tray. She didn't understand at once. For about 2 seconds, her face was the face of someone trying to fit together 2 pieces of something that had never belonged together. Then she understood. She remembered the cold wall beneath her palm. She remembered the gray tile and the white napkins scattered all around her. She remembered the kitchen jacket folded in half beneath the back of her neck. And she remembered that when she woke up, Ezra Fallon had sat beside her for a very long time, without saying a single word about someone having walked past, and now, standing here, she understood why he hadn't said it. Delia looked at Rowan Blackwood. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the man who had knelt before 200 people 3 hours ago. She looked at the cracked leather notebook on the desk, the notebook that recorded the 11 days her mother had sat, watching over a 19-year-old boy, on a plastic chair in the staff break room. She looked at his bare left wrist, and when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It was only very tired. "She kept watch over you for 11 nights, Delia said. She stood in front of the door and lied to two men so they wouldn't find you. She gave you everything she had. She stopped. And you stepped over me." Rowan didn't answer. "Then you're no different from them," she said. He stood there behind the desk, both hands resting on the wood on either side of the notebook. He could have said he didn't know who she was. He could have said he was late for an appointment. He could have said there had already been a gray-haired man there, that she hadn't been lying alone, that someone was taking care of her. All of those things were true. Rowan Blackwood didn't say any of them. 3 days later, on a Monday afternoon, Delia Rourke returned to the 42nd floor because someone had called her at 10 o'clock that morning and said Mr. Blackwood wanted to see her, and she had almost refused, and then she had agreed. She arrived at 4 o'clock. Beyond the glass wall, the October sky was gray and low, and Lake Michigan had the color of tin. On the desk lay a blue folder placed squarely in the center, and beside it, still in the same place, were the tin box, the leather-bound notebook, and the brass key. Rowan Blackwood wasn't standing by the window this time. He was seated in the chair behind the desk, and when she walked in, he stood and pulled out the chair across from him. Delia sat down. He sat after she did. "I had someone look into your mother's medical records," he said. "I didn't ask you first. If you want me to destroy everything in this folder, I'll destroy it right now, and you'll never have to see it." She looked at the folder. "Why did you look into it?" "Because I wanted to know how she was cared for," he said. "I meant to give something back." I didn't know what to give back. Delia reached out and pulled the folder toward herself. She opened it. The first page was a copy of the health insurance contract under the name Maren Rourke. The policy number, beginning with the 4 digits Delia had recited from memory in 20 clinics over 2 years. The date of signing was 19 years ago. The second page was a list of payments, one for every month, not a single month missing, including the months Delia knew for certain her mother had gone without something in order to pay it. The third page was a form, a contract termination request made by the policyholder. The date printed in the upper right corner was October 14th. At the bottom of the form, on the line reserved for the signature, there was a name written in blue ink. Delia looked at it. She looked at it for a very long time. Her mother wrote a capital M by pulling one stroke straight downward before curving up, and she always left a small gap between the R and the O in her last name because she wrote slowly and lifted the pen between those two letters. The signature on this form had no gap. It ran in one unbroken motion. It had been written by someone who wrote quickly, someone who had never had to lift a pen between two letters in their life. The fourth page was an assessment report prepared by a private firm 4 days ago, consisting of 3 paragraphs, and in the final paragraph there was one word printed in bold. Delia didn't read that far. She closed the folder. She placed both hands on the blue cover. Her fingers spread wide, and she sat still that way. She didn't cry. Her eyes were dry. Her shoulders didn't move. In the room, there was only the steady sound of the ventilation system, running somewhere above the ceiling. Then she looked up, and she looked at Rowan Blackwood, and she asked in the calm voice of someone asking what time a train leaves. If the policy had still been active, she said. If that October no one had signed this form, how long would she have lived? Rowan didn't answer. He looked down at the desktop. He reached out and turned the folder slightly, a motion with no purpose, only something for his hand to do. How long? He looked up. He could have said he didn't know. He could have said no one could know, that things like this couldn't be predicted, that some people lived another 6 months, and some lived another 6 years. All of those were things people said to one another at moments like this, and all of them were kinder than the truth. Rowan Blackwood had read the last 3 pages of that folder at 11 o'clock the night before, alone, in this room, and he had sat for a long time after he finished. With the treatment plan that policy would have covered, he said, the doctor recorded 2 years. He paused for 1 beat, maybe 3. Delia nodded. She nodded once very neatly, the nod of someone who had just heard a piece of information and had taken it in. Then she stood. She pushed the chair back in, straight, close to the edge of the desk, exactly the way a server pushes in a chair after a guest leaves. She went to the door. She opened it, stepped into the hallway, and closed it behind her very softly, only letting it touch the frame without latching shut. Rowan Blackwood sat still in the room, and through that narrow gap in the door he heard a sound he had never heard in all 34 years of his life. It wasn't crying. Crying has rhythm, has breath, has sobs, and people can give it a name. This sound was strangled from beginning to end, stopped right in the throat, and all that escaped was a very small broken noise coming from behind a hand pressed hard over a mouth, out in the hallway, from a woman who had lived 27 years and had never once been allowed to trouble anyone. 3 years. She could had 3 more years with her mother, and for the past 3 years, she had been blaming herself for another person's crime. Delia left Kingsley Tower at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Rowan Blackwood remained seated in his office until the sky had gone completely dark, and during that time he read nothing, called no one, and turned on no lights. At 7:15, he reached for the desk phone and dialed a number in Northbrook. The person who picked up was the chief executive officer of the insurance company that had held Marin Rourke's policy for 19 years, a 54-year-old man eating dinner with his family, and when he heard the caller's name, he apologized to his wife, went into his study, and closed the door behind him. Rowan didn't say hello. He read the policy number. He read the date on the termination form. He said that a handwriting analysis had been prepared 4 days ago, and that the report was lying on the desk in front of him. The other man began talking about internal procedures, about how the company processed more than 200,000 files each year, about how he would have the entire matter reviewed within the week. Rowan let him finish. Then he spoke, and his voice was very ordinary, the voice of a man confirming an appointment with the dentist. "You have 1 night to find out who signed it." He paused. "If you don't have a name by tomorrow morning, I'll assume it was you." He put the phone down. He didn't threaten anything further. He didn't say what would happen if he made that assumption, and he didn't need to, because in Chicago, there were enough people who understood that clearly for the sentence to carry its own weight, all the way 90 kilometers north. At 6:20 the next morning, Deacon Rule called Rowan from O'Hare International Airport and reported that the executive had boarded the 5:45 flight to Phoenix alone, carrying 1 small suitcase, and that his wife was still at home. Deacon went on to say that if Rowan wanted, he could have someone meet the man on the other end. Rowan didn't answer right away. On his end of the line, there was the sound of him pouring water into a glass. "Let him run," Rowan said. Deacon was silent. "A man who runs is a man who knows," Rowan said. Then he hung up. At 9 o'clock that morning, the entire management team of Astor and Vine was summoned to the 42nd floor. 7 people walked into the conference room, and 7 people walked out after 18 minutes, and not one of them was allowed to return to the 41st floor to collect personal belongings, because their personal belongings had already been packed into boxes and placed in the ground floor lobby. The shift manager, the man of about 40 in the white shirt wrinkled at the elbows, was the last to walk out. He carried his stack of papers with him. He didn't understand why. No one explained it to him. That afternoon, one of Rowan's men went down to the kitchen and told Ezra Fallon that beginning tomorrow, he would approve all food orders, approve the work schedule, and approve the personnel list, and that his salary had been adjusted, and that if he had any requests, he only had to say so. Ezra wiped his hands on a towel. He asked whether he would be allowed to take back a former employee if she wanted to return. The man said that was his decision. Ezra nodded, turned back to his pot of broth, and asked nothing more. That night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, a black car stopped outside the gate of a cemetery in Bridgeport. The cemetery was small, wedged between an auto repair shop and a row of brick houses, and its gate was held by nothing more than a loose loop of chain that anyone could unfasten. Rowan Blackwood walked in alone. He wore a long coat and carried nothing in his hands except for one small object in his right coat pocket. Dew had settled on the ground, and the dry grass crackled beneath his shoes. He walked along the main path, turned left at the 4th row, and found it near the middle of that row, a gray granite headstone, the cheapest kind the funeral home had, rising no higher than his knee. On the stone were 2 lines, 1 name, 2 numbers separated by a dash, nothing else, no sentence, no picture, no flowers. Rowan Blackwood stood before that stone for a very long time. He didn't kneel, he didn't bow his head. He also said nothing, not one word, not aloud, and not even inside his mind, because he had tried all through the drive from downtown to this place, and he had not found a single sentence that wasn't a lie. Dew gathered on the shoulders of his coat. Somewhere behind the auto repair shop, a dog barked 3 times and then stopped. Then Rowan reached into his right coat pocket and took out a small tin of licorice candy. The kind drugstores had stopped selling long ago. the kind he had needed someone to search for 2 days before finding one in an antique shop on Clark Street. He bent down. He placed it on the face of the headstone, close to the foot of the line where her name was carved. He straightened, and he turned away. Over the next 4 days, Rowan Blackwood had his people trace the entire path of the termination form, and by Friday afternoon, a name appeared at the end of that chain, not the name of the person who had signed it, but the name of the person who had brought that form into the office in Northbrook 3 years ago, and sat there waiting until it was stamped. That person worked at Calumet Harbor. That person worked for Deacon Rule. On Saturday night, at 10:40, Delia's phone vibrated once on the table in her basement apartment, unknown number. She looked at it for a long time before opening it. There were exactly 2 lines of text. "Don't let him come alone. He'll kill me, and I'll let him." Delia read it 3 times. She didn't need anyone to sign a name beneath it. In the past 2 years, there had only been one person in the world who called Rowan Blackwood him in that voice, and only one person who had once stood in the middle of this room, beneath the low ceiling, and told her she didn't understand who he worked for. She read it a 4th time. She read the words, "I'll let him," and she stood up, and she put on her coat. Warehouse number 7 stood on the edge of Calumet Harbor. Close to the water, a steel building 90 meters long, with a high sheet metal roof and small windows set near the ceiling. At night, there was nothing there except the sound of water striking the concrete pilings and the sound of wind slipping through the gaps in the roll-up door. Rowan drove there alone. He parked outside the fence, 40 meters from the warehouse door, and walked in. He brought no one with him. He carried nothing either. His long coat was buttoned shut, both hands tucked into his pockets, and when he crossed the threshold beneath the roll-up door that had been lifted halfway, all 7 men inside saw that he held nothing in his hands. Deacon Rule stood in the middle of the warehouse, beneath a single light bulb hanging from a long cord. 6 of his men stood in an arc behind him, spread out, and 3 of them kept their right hands hanging down along their sides, slightly curved. Rowan stopped about 7 steps from Deacon. He stood right beneath the edge of the light, his shadow stretching long behind him across the damp concrete floor. He didn't speak to Deacon. He looked over his shoulder at the 6 men behind him, one by one, and he held his gaze on each face long enough for every one of them to understand that he was counting. Then Rowan drew his right hand from his coat pocket. In his hand was a notebook. It wasn't the cracked leather-bound notebook. It was smaller, with a black plastic cover, the kind of notebook sold in any corner store, and it had grown thick because scraps of paper were tucked between its pages. He held it at chest height for a moment, so all 7 men could see it. Then he threw it down onto the concrete floor between himself and Deacon. It landed, bounced once, and lay face down, and one scrap of paper slipped out from the binding and slid about a handspan away. No one bent to pick it up. Rowan didn't say what that notebook was. He didn't need to. He only looked straight at the man standing at the far right end of the arc, and he said a name, the name of a hospital, and he said August. The man's face went pale. Then Rowan looked at the second man and said the name of a high school on the south side of the city. Then he looked at the third, and he said nothing at all. He only looked, and the third man was the first to step back. He took 1 step back, then 2, then turned and walked toward the roll-up door, and the sound of his shoes striking the concrete was the only sound inside the warehouse for the next 10 seconds. The second man followed. Then the man at the far right. Deacon didn't turn his head. He remained beneath the light bulb, eyes fixed on Rowan, and he listened to one pair of shoes, after another, leave his back. The last man stopped at the threshold, looked back once, then stepped out too. The footsteps faded across the harbor, then disappeared completely into the wind. Inside warehouse number 7, only 2 men remained, 1 light bulb hanging from a long cord, and 1 black plastic-covered notebook lying face down on the damp concrete between them. Rowan Blackwood put his right hand back into his coat pocket. "Who signed that form?" he said. Deacon Rule didn't answer. He stood beneath the light bulb, both hands hanging at his sides, and he looked at Rowan Blackwood with the eyes of a man who had known in advance how tonight would end and had arrived on time. Rowan stepped forward. 1 punch. Deacon fell. He dropped sideways onto the damp concrete floor, bracing himself with 1 hand, and he lay there on his side for about 3 seconds, breathing. Rowan didn't strike again. He stood looking down, then took off his long coat, draped it over a wooden crate nearby, and sat down beside Deacon, crouching with both elbows resting on his knees, both hands hanging between them. He sat there in the posture of a man waiting by a river for a fish to bite. Deacon pushed himself up to sit. He wiped the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at that hand, then leaned his back against the leg of the crate. "Who signed the order to cancel her insurance?" Rowan said. Deacon didn't answer. 6 years, Rowan said. "You sat outside my office door for 6 years. I'm asking you one question. Look up at the light bulb hanging from the long cord. It swayed very slowly because of the wind slipping through the gap beneath the roll-up door, and its shadow swept back and forth across the concrete floor." He said nothing. Then behind them, beyond the threshold, came the sound of footsteps. Both men turned their heads at once. Delia Rourke stepped into warehouse number 7. She wore a faded cloth coat with the collar turned up, and she walked slowly because the concrete floor was damp and because she was 7 months pregnant. She passed the black plastic-covered notebook lying face down on the floor. She didn't look at it. She stepped into the circle of light beneath the single bulb and stopped about 4 steps from Deacon. Rowan stood. He stepped back half a pace. Deacon Rule looked at her. In 6 years, he had learned how to let nothing show on his face, and that skill held for exactly 2 seconds before it shattered. And in that moment, his face was the face of a 28-year-old man kneeling on one knee on a wet sidewalk after the rain. Delia didn't ask him why he had left. She didn't ask about the envelope. She didn't ask about 2 years of silence, about the fact that he had never once rung the bell of that apartment, about the fact that she had spent 2 birthdays alone. She stood there beneath the light and asked him only one question. "Do you know how my mother died?" Deacon Rule turned his face away. That was the answer. Delia stood still. She looked at the back of his neck, watched his shoulders rise and fall, and she stood there until she understood that she had known this from the moment she read that message on the table in her basement apartment, that she had driven 40 minutes through the night down to Calumet Harbor to hear this man say aloud what she already knew. She took 1 step closer. "Tell me who signed it." Deacon lifted his head. He looked at her, only at her, and he didn't look at Rowan Blackwood standing 3 steps away. His mouth opened. He said that name very softly, and inside that 90-meter steel warehouse, it still rang out clearly as if someone had struck a metal pipe. Hollis Ashgrove. No one said anything for 10 seconds. The light bulb swayed. Outside, water struck the concrete pilings. Then Deacon pushed himself to his feet. He rose slowly, one hand gripping the leg of the wooden crate, and when he was standing straight, he faced Delia. And between them there were only 3 steps and months of agonizing silence neither of them had ever wanted. "Delia," he said. She didn't answer. "The day I came to that apartment, the day I put the envelope on the table," he stopped. He raised a hand to adjust his collar, the gesture he always made when he needed 1 second to swallow something down, and this time that gesture didn't help him at all. "There was another piece of paper in the inside pocket of my coat." Delia didn't move. "They gave it to me 2 days before that," Deacon said. "They told me to deal with you." He looked straight into her eyes. I tore it up in the car, in the parking lot before I drove to your place. Then I took every bit of money I had in the bank, put it in the envelope, and came to tell you to leave Chicago." He stopped. "You didn't take it. You said you were keeping the baby. And I stood there and understood that if I ever came back to Morgan Street even once, they'd find you. And I said the worst sentence I could think of, because it was the only sentence I was certain would make you never come looking for me." Delia Rourke stood beneath the light bulb hanging from the long cord. Her hands hung at her sides. And for the past 3 years, she had called this man by one name inside her mind, and tonight she stood there and understood that she had called him the wrong one. 3:00 in the morning. The 42nd floor. The cracked, leather-bound notebook lay open on the desk at the last page, and beneath the desk lamp, the torn strip of paper running along the spine showed clearly, down to every uneven rise and dip of the ripped edge. Rowan Blackwood stood on the other side of the desk. Delia sat in the chair across from him because this time she could no longer remain standing. He looked at that torn edge for a very long time, then lifted his head. "Who tore out page 12? She didn't hesitate. "I did." He stood still. 2 months ago, Delia said. "I fainted in the employee restroom. Ezra found me. He took me to a clinic on the south side, the kind where they don't ask for papers." She looked down at her hands. "The doctor said the pregnancy was weak. The heartbeat was slower than normal. She told me I had to rest completely." She stopped. I asked her what would happen if I kept working shifts. Rowan said nothing. She said I could lose the baby. Outside the window, a coal barge moved across the black lake, its side lights sliding slowly along the horizon. That night, I went home, Delia said. I sat down on the floor, I took out the box and I opened it. I hadn't opened it once in 3 years, do you understand? I carried it with me from the apartment on Emerald Street down to Bridgeport. I kept it under the stack of towels, and I'd never opened it once. Because my mother told me to give it to someone named Blackwood, and I didn't know who that person was. And I was afraid that if I read it, I would have to go looking for him. She looked up. That night, I opened it, because I thought if I lost the baby, then there wouldn't be anyone left for me to keep a promise for. She read the whole notebook in 2 hours. She read 11 days. She read about the bowl of soup in the thermos, the plastic chair in the staff break room, the 2 men who came to the warehouse asking about a 19-year-old boy. She read about the $4,000. She read the line saying that she would tell her daughter her mother had lost her wallet. And she turned to page 12. On that page, her mother had written in small handwriting slanting to the right, and she wrote that on the night of February 2nd, before she found the boy in the pile of pallets in row C, she had gone outside to dump mop water behind the warehouse, and she had seen something. She wrote 3 sentences about it. Then she wrote 1 separate line, set apart from the rest. The man who pulled the trigger was Hollis Ashgrove. I saw him under the warehouse light. Beneath it was a blank space, and in that blank space, in different ink, in the trembling handwriting of a hand that had grown much weaker, she had added 2 more lines on a day 12 years later, September 14th. The doctor says I have 2 years left. I'm going to write to the police. I have nothing left to lose. Delia sat on the basement floor all that night with that page in her hand. She remembered the date on the termination form, the date the dispatcher had read to her over the phone, on the night her mother had a high fever, October 14th. She sat there and counted. 30 days. Rowan Blackwood stood motionless behind the desk. He didn't ask anything. Delia went on. The next morning, I went to the public library in Bridgeport and searched that name. I searched for 3 hours. She looked at him. In the announcement section of a financial newspaper, there was a photograph. It showed 2 families. Underneath it said Hollis Ashgrove's daughter was going to marry Rowan Blackwood in the spring. She said the next sentence very slowly. And I realized that if I gave you this whole notebook, you would read page 12. You would know who killed your father. You would go looking for him. She stopped. And you would die. Or you would spend the rest of your life in prison. And this notebook, this box, my mother's 11 days, all of it would mean nothing anymore. She placed both hands on her belly. I sat on the floor all night, she said. One hand was here, the other was holding that page. I sat there until morning came and I saw people's feet passing outside the window. Rowan didn't move. Then I tore it out. The room went silent. Delia Rourke lifted her head, and she looked straight into the eyes of the man who had knelt before 200 people because he had never once asked her mother's name. Don't think I did it for you, she said. Her voice didn't tremble. I didn't save you because I'm noble. I didn't know who you were. I had never spoken to you once in 4 years. She stopped. I tore it out because I didn't have the strength to bury one more person. Rowan Blackwood stood there. On the desk, beside the notebook, there was a glass tumbler he had filled with water at 11 o'clock at night and had not taken a single sip from. He reached out. He shattered the glass with his bare hand. Delia didn't flinch. She sat still in the chair, both hands resting on her belly, and she looked at him. Rowan Blackwood stood with his head lowered before that desk for a very long time. His father had died in warehouse number 7 on a February night 15 years ago, and in those 15 years, he had built an empire on that very harbor, had signed contracts there, had crossed that concrete floor hundreds of times, and he had never known why. Now he knew. He knew because a woman who cleaned the night shift had seen everything under the warehouse light, and had kept silent for 12 years to raise her daughter, and had only dared to speak when she knew she was about to die. And 30 days after she wrote that line, someone had signed a name with no gap between 2 letters. On Tuesday morning, at 8:15, a neighbor on Morgan Street looked out from a second-floor window and saw a charcoal-colored car parked in front of the red brick building. She didn't remember anyone going in or coming out. She only remembered that the car stayed there for about 4 minutes, then left the street, turned left at the intersection, and disappeared. At 20 minutes to 9, the phone on the desk on the 42nd floor rang. Rowan Blackwood picked it up. The voice on the other end was the voice of a man who had slept well for 40 years. Hollis Ashgrove didn't waste words. He said she was somewhere warm, with a chair to sit in, and no one had touched her, and he said it in exactly the same voice one uses to report that the dinner table has been reserved. Then he said what he wanted. All of Blackwood Group. Shares, harbor contracts, control of the 3 cold storage warehouses on the south side, and the 4 companies held under intermediary names that only 7 people in the world knew belonged to whom. He said his lawyers would be on the 42nd floor in 30 minutes, with all the paperwork prepared in advance, and Rowan heard in that sentence that the documents had been prepared a long time ago, perhaps before the engagement party, perhaps even before the day Hollis Ashgrove first invited him to dinner. Rowan didn't negotiate. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't demand to hear her voice. He put the phone down and told the assistant outside the door to let the lawyers in when they arrived. 30 minutes later, 2 people carrying leather briefcases entered the office. They spread the documents across the desk in 4 stacks. Rowan Blackwood sat down, took the pen, and signed. He signed the first stack, then the second. He didn't read a single clause. He didn't turn back a single page. His pen moved evenly, and in 23 minutes, 15 years vanished from his hands and passed into another man's. On the desk, beside the final stack of papers, the cracked leather-bound notebook still lay open at the last page. One lawyer glanced at it once, then gathered the documents into his briefcase. At 11:20, another car stopped in front of Kingsley Tower, and Delia Rourke walked into the lobby, alone, her coat buttoned shut, moving slowly. She went up to the 42nd floor. She didn't ask what he had signed. She looked at the empty desk and understood. That afternoon, Rowan drove to the Ashgrove mansion on LaSalle Street to deliver the safe key and access codes, the last things remaining in the transfer. Hollis stood at the door, hands in his pockets, and accepted the envelope with the expression of a man receiving the morning paper. Rowan had taken 3 steps away when he stopped. He didn't turn his head. 15 years ago, he said, you killed a man in warehouse number 7 at Calumet Harbor. The night of February 2nd, behind him there was no sound. Did you know he had a son? Rowan Blackwood continued to his car, and he didn't look back once. He didn't need to look. He had heard the envelope fall onto the stone steps. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he drove to the federal headquarters on Dearborn Street. He brought a paper bag with him. Inside the bag were the cracked leather-bound notebook, page 12, which Delia had taken from the bottom of the tin box and returned to him that morning without saying a word, and the blue folder with the handwriting analysis. He didn't call his lawyer. He went through security, placed the paper bag on the conveyor belt, and told the officer on duty that he had come to turn himself in. They led him into a hallway. In the middle of that hallway was a glass window looking into interrogation room number 3, and when Rowan Blackwood passed that window, his steps slowed. Inside, sitting in the chair with his back to the door, both hands resting on the steel table, was Deacon Rule. The escort said he had been sitting in there for 2 hours. He had confessed to the entire transport route through Pier number 7, the names of 7 intermediary companies, and 4 cases that he said he had decided on himself, carried out himself, with no one ordering him and no one knowing. Those 4 cases, if the court accepted his testimony, would send Deacon Rule away for a very long time and would leave Rowan Blackwood outside. Deacon turned his head. The 2 men looked at each other through the glass. Deacon didn't nod. He didn't signal. He only looked at Rowan with the eyes of a man who had calculated very carefully, very precisely, exactly the way he had done for all 6 years, and had already made his choice. Rowan Blackwood placed his hand on the doorknob of interrogation room number 4. He could turn away. He could let the other man pay that price in his place, and he could live the rest of his life with a leather-bound notebook in a safe and a tin of licorice on a headstone in Bridgeport. He opened the door. He stepped inside. He sat down, placed the paper bag on the table, and began to confess. 3 weeks after Rowan Blackwood walked into interrogation room number 4, Corinne Ashgrove came to the federal headquarters on Dearborn Street on a Thursday morning, without an appointment, without bringing a lawyer. She placed on the table a wine-colored cloth, bound notebook, the kind her father had always kept in the second drawer of his desk, and locked away every night. Inside were the cash payments he had recorded in pencil for 21 years, initials, amounts, dates. And on page 87, there were 3 letters standing beside a number, and beside October 14th from 3 years before. The federal agent asked why she had brought it in. Corinne sat with her back straight in the chair, both hands resting on her thighs, and it took her a long while to answer. She said she had hated that woman. She said she had hated her because she was poor, because she wore a uniform 2 sizes too large, because that night she stood in the middle of the floor and refused to lower her head. She said she had humiliated her in front of 200 people and would never be forgiven for it, and she hadn't come here to ask anyone for forgiveness. Then she looked straight into the agent's eyes. I hated her because she was poor, she said. But I didn't kill anyone. Don't put me in the same place as him. She stood and walked out, and she had no idea that in that drawer, on page 123, there were 3 more payments she hadn't had time to read. The trial lasted 11 months. Hollis Ashgrove was sentenced to life in prison, with no parole, at the age of 63. Rowan Blackwood received 3 years, reduced because of his full cooperation. There was no miracle. No one stood up in the courtroom to read a letter that changed the judge's mind. No mysterious witness appeared at the last minute, and when the judge struck the gavel, Rowan only nodded once, neatly, the nod of a man who had just heard a piece of information and had taken it in. But long before that final gavel struck, while the legal battle was just beginning in the winter, the day Delia Rourke gave birth arrived. It was a day near the end of January, with light snow falling, and the midwife said the delivery had been much easier than she had expected for a mother so anemic. That afternoon, 2 federal agents escorted a man to the hospital, in handcuffs, wearing a detention uniform. He was allowed to sit in the hallway for 20 minutes. He didn't go into the room. He didn't ask to see the baby. He sat on the blue plastic chair attached to the wall, his head lowered, his handcuffed hands resting between his knees, and in the past 15 years, Rowan Blackwood had never cried in front of anyone. And that afternoon, in a hospital hallway on the south side of Chicago, he cried for a very long time without making a sound. When the 20 minutes were over, he stood. He left on the chair a tin box dented at one corner. Inside was the brass key, page 12 carefully pieced back together with clear tape, each torn edge matched to the next with great care, and a piece of paper folded in half with a few lines written on it. 3 years. I get out in March. If you're still at Rourke House then, I'll knock. If not, I'll walk past. A nurse entered the room and asked whether she had chosen a name for the baby. Delia reached into her pocket and took out a piece of paper folded into quarters, so wrinkled that the creases had worn white, the piece of paper Ezra Fallon had picked up from the marble floor that night and kept in the pocket of his kitchen jacket for all those months before returning it to her without saying a single word. She opened it. There were 4 names on it. 3 had been crossed out. She looked at the remaining name, and she spoke it aloud, and her voice was very soft. Marin. 3 years later, in Bridgeport, on the foundation of an old warehouse that had been torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, there stood a 2-story building painted ivory white, with a wooden sign hanging above the front door, Rourke House. Its doors were open from 7 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, free of charge, and most of the people who came in for care were third-shift workers, cleaners, night guards, people who carried trays. Delia Rourke wore a white coat. She was in her 2nd year of nursing at a community college, and she still studied at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the waiting room was empty. Ezra Fallon cooked in the kitchen at the back, and he still told anyone who accepted a meal box from his hands that he had made too much and throwing it away would be a waste. On Saturday afternoon, little Ivy Fallon, 9 years old, sat at the reception desk drawing while waiting for her grandfather to finish work. She held up the paper to show Delia. On it was a blue tin box with 2 white wings spread wide on either side. I drew the box with wings so it can carry candy everywhere, she said. Delia smiled. She took the drawing and taped it to the wall behind the reception desk, straight and neat at eye level. Outside it was already dark. There was a knock at the door. Little Marin, 3 years old, who had been coloring on the floor, sprang to her feet and ran into the hallway. Mommy, she called back, there's a man holding a candy box like ours. Delia Rourke stood up from her chair. She looked toward the door. There are debts that can never be repaid with money, and there are people who spend their whole lives being called by their work instead of by the name their mother gave them. This story isn't about a crime boss or a waitress. It is about how many people we have stepped over in the hallways of our own lives without stopping, and how the kindness of a woman who cleaned the night shift could travel farther than 15 years, farther than an empire, farther even than her own death. Ask the name of the person who serves your table tonight. Remember the name of the person who sweeps the hallway where you work. Because the worth of a human being has never rested in what they wear on their body, but in what they choose to do when no one is watching them at all. If this story touched something inside you, leave a like, share it with someone who once lifted you up when you had nothing to give in return, and subscribe to our channel to hear new stories every day. How did tonight's story make you feel, and which detail stayed longest in your heart? Write it in the comments so we can listen to the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always have good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.